Scottish Council for Global Affairs in the University of Glasgow. I'm really grateful to Dr. Jade Sarkar from our School of Social and Political Sciences for convening this really important conference. I'd like to thank all of you present here and online on behalf of Jade and our colleagues who have organised this conference for joining us. I know that some of you have travelled a very long distance to be here. And as international historians, you'll all be very acutely aware that we live in interesting times. Russia's invasion of Ukraine forces us again to consider the value of peace on the continent of Europe. And indeed, with the creation of the European Union, and formerly the European Coal and Steel Community in the 1950s, we had perhaps taken for granted the peace the majority of countries, at least in Western Europe, had enjoyed for decades. And whilst, of course, we have had conflict in the Balkans, and Europe has felt the impact of the wars in Syria and further afield in North Africa and the Middle East by the recent refugee crises, the war in Ukraine has perhaps made the threat of war in Europe feel much more real. It's played out on our television screens, and we've seen footage and updates from the conflict instantaneously on social media and streaming platforms. And as we seek to end this conflict in Ukraine, we must look back at history to understand what we've learned. We must provide opportunities to discuss and debate the shifting global landscape that we're navigating. So I'm really delighted also that in addition to the University of Scottish Council for Global Affairs, which is led here in Glasgow by Professor Peter Jackson, Chair of Global Security, has co-sponsored this conference. The SCGA operates in partnership with the Universities of Edinburgh and St Andrews and many other organisations. It's supported by both the UK and Scottish governments, and indeed is working across the UK to do some really interesting work in the area of international relations. And it's about raising the level of public understanding of major global issues. It's about providing a platform for the experts that we have in Scotland to debate and discuss the most pressing global challenges and indeed the shifting spheres of global power. And it's really fitting that this week's conference that Jay and colleagues have organised will examine the very treaty that shifted the balance of power on our continent 100 years ago, and further how the Treaty of Lausanne became a blueprint for territorial divisions as a solution to prolonged political conflict. In the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire had earned the unbecoming title of the sick man on the Bosphorus. Periods of territorial conquest and wealth peaked under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1500s. We saw the expansion of the Ottoman Empire spanning more than 3.4 million square kilometers, stretching from Algeria to Hungary and even across to the Mughal Empire. And Suleiman controlled almost the entire Eastern Mediterranean, making trade much easier with Constantinople and Levant. But by the late 1800s, the empire was fatigued, it was bulging, no longer commanded the strength or economic power it once held. And several attempts at reform kept the empire afloat, but success was short-lived, and the most ambitious of these reforms to modernize the empire, the Tanzimat reforms, created a debt crisis in the 1870s, and the fragility of the Ottoman Empire left it unable to withstand defeat in World War I, and the Allied European powers sought to carve up what remained of the sick man on the Bosphorus through the punitive Treaty of Sèvres, which proposed ceding large parts of the Ottoman territory to the Allied powers and creating zones of occupation. And this approach, of course, ignited the supporters of the Army General Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to corral together and launch the Turkish War of Independence, marking a key moment in Turkey's history. And to this day, I understand that in Turkey, the Treaty of Sèvres has become a symbol which more than 100 years later is present in public discourse in the country. I'm told that Sèvres syndrome has become a term in Turkey to describe the practice of Western powers imposing double standards and attempting to interfere in the nation's affairs. The War of Independence ended with an armistice in 1922, followed by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. And 100 years later, this treaty and the history surrounding it continued to shape the Turkish Republic and its relationship with its neighbours today. And in fact, I believe that of all the treaties concluded in the aftermath of World War I, stand corrected by historians that that's true, only the Treaty of Lausanne has survived. And indeed, to this day, General Atatürk is revered as the hero of the Turkish Republic, featuring on the Turkish lira, and his legacy referenced heavily by both President Erdogan and the opposition parties during the recent elections in Turkey. And in fact, the country even rebranded itself as Turkey last year using the name given by Ataturk to the nation in 1923 after its declaration of independence. Now, I mention all this because there's many lessons we can take from the lead up to the Treaty of Lausanne to better understand the power dynamics that we see in Europe today. The long-standing challenges that the EU sees with Turkey's accession to the European Union, the continued tension between the Turkish state and Kurdish and Armenian populations would stem back to the preceding and succeeding years of Lausanne. And this complex history also contextualizes the economic challenges facing Turkey today, and equally goes some way to explaining President Erdogan's stance on the West and preference of working and trading with Eastern and Middle Eastern powers. Now, there's also much to say today about Turkey's recent power in influencing the negotiations of Sweden's membership in NATO, and again, perhaps how the Western nations had underestimated the extent of this power. But the crux of my remarks is that major conferences like the one we're at today provide our academic communities with an opportunity to draw these comparisons, to exchange ideas, to better understand the big global issues of the day. These conferences matter greatly for us as a university in Glasgow and to our academics and students, not only to our senior academics, many of them here today, but to our early mid-career historians from our colleges of arts and colleges of social sciences here today, who are far better equipped with knowledge to speak on the Treaty of Lausanne than I am in these rather imprecise remarks. Now, I know that colleagues are very much looking forward to the opportunity to collaborate, to connect, to hopefully build new relationships and opportunities for collaboration in the future between Glasgow and the institutions you represent. I mentioned today we are in a new building. It's been designed to break down traditional barriers to research collaborations across all disciplines here at the University of Glasgow. So in that spirit, I really sincerely hope that you'll enjoy this inaugural conference and seek out those opportunities to build bridges, to build collaborations. I started my remarks today reflecting on the conflict in Ukraine, and I wanted just to finish with a couple of thoughts. Firstly, as I said, we find ourselves in Europe in a situation which necessitates self-reflection. Like the contemporary history of the Treaty of Lausanne in 100 years since then, we need to understand how this conflict in Ukraine has escalated, and most importantly, how we navigate out of this conflict and into peacetime again. Our role as universities as bastions of free thought, of speech and debate is essential in this regard. And this is why the likes of our Scottish Council on Global Affairs act as such important facilitators of debate. Secondly, we must actively seek to collaborate across borders and to seek the views of our international peers. Too often in the past, the West has neglected to consider the perspective of other nations in evaluating and making foreign policy. There's much to be learned from transnational discourse, and again, that's why conferences like these, where such a variety of international voices can get together to share their own perspectives and experiences, are so vital. And thirdly and finally, there's much to learn about the wider global challenges that we face when evaluating significant moments in history, like the Treaty of Lausanne. There's much to be learned about the impact of dividing communities, displacing populations, and what can be achieved through collective global action, which can be applied to major challenges that we face today, from the climate emergencies to economic and health inequalities. And again, it won't be a surprise to you to hear that I believe universities are the catalyzers of these discussions. It's our research, it's our global reach, it's our willingness to share knowledge with one another that will see us better address these global challenges. So with all that said, Jay, I hope this conference is inspiring to you and colleagues. I hope it's insightful, allows you to connect. I hope you enjoy your time in the ARC and at the University of Glasgow, and I wish you a very good conference. Thank you.
All right. A very good morning to you all. We are going to begin with Glenda Sluga's keynote in a bit. But welcome to Partition Machine, and those of you who are visiting outside of Glasgow, a very warm welcome. I have been recently informed that the sun is shining today, not here, as always. And those of you joining online, very warm welcome. Hello. We are hybrids, so feel free to ask questions during the Q&A. And this conference, as Anton just mentioned, was made possible by generous funding for the British Academy, and co-sponsorship with Scottish Council on Global Affairs and the College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow. And over the next 2 days, as you can tell from the program, we'll be discussing various interconnected themes such as the travelogues of partition, world making, race making, imperial genealogies, among others. So people make Glasgow, you may have seen the poster all around the city. People also make conferences. So without the support of people like Linda, who's sitting outside, Sam, Jonathan, Andy, Rochelle, Neil, nothing would have been possible. So let's begin by thanking Brand. All right, great. So please join me in welcoming Professor Glenda Sluga, who is a professor of international history and capitalism at the European University Institute of Florence, Italy, and most recently the author of The Invention of International Order, Remaking Europe After Napoleon, published by Princeton University Press in 2021. In 2020, she was awarded an ERC Advanced grant overseeing a 5-year research program on 20th century international economic thinking and the complex history of globalization. Professor Sluga is also an Australian Research Council Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellow and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Glenda, welcome. It's really an honor. Thank you so much.
I'm so happy to be here, and Jay has been such a wonderful organizer. I'm sure you'll all agree. And I got to meet you in Sydney quite a few years ago, so I'm very pleased to be back here. And of course, you know, your aid to what is becoming a really, I think, you know, exciting concentration of international historians here at Glasgow. The building's amazing, right? So I'm trying to think of ways of, you know, the other institutions I intersect with my colleagues. It's wonderful. So it's an inspiring space, and I think it makes one feel that, you know, things happen or should be happening. So I will try to start what is happening now. In some ways, the question I posed in the lecture, what does the history of partition tell us about the modern liberal international order, comes very much out of the more recent work I've been doing in the 19th century. And I think that explains the cast of some of what I'm going to argue today. I'll start by referencing, just check that, so how will that be? So I will start by referencing Nigerian historian Godfrey Nwanaroa Osogwe, who writes in volume 7 of the UNESCO General History of Africa, published in 1985, that the historiography of the partition has become one of the most controversial and emotive issues of our time. It presents the historian with the awesome task of making sense of an extraordinary phantasmagoria of conflicting interpretations. Now, of course, one does that thing we do now, just go to Wikipedia. I went there, have a look, what's it about partition. And you can see all the different kinds of events going back to the ancient world that it regards as partition. And of course, I think in the literature, the science and the history, much more specific sort of definitions of partition are now you know, agreed upon. And I'm not going to go through any, you know, these, or in fact any specific partition process. Instead, I want to make a very specific argument about the 19th century. Not that partition didn't exist before the 19th century necessarily. If there was an early modernist in the room, that we definitely able to tell us that it did. Because they always are able to tell us that something happened before. But that its 20th century characteristics became defined by and definitive of the liberal international order put into place in the 19th century. Nearly 40 years after Osogwe wrote his essay, the landscape of this historiography has hardly become any less conflicted, despite the concatenation of facts, methodologies, and concepts, few of which complement each other, many of which remain in contestation. Not least, they contest the definition of partition, what it is, as well as why or when. Even the how of partition seems to be under constant review. A recent study of short and long-term consequences of the 1947 partitioning of India underscores that little is known about the conditions under which what appears to be a viable political compromise devolves into a human disaster. This is a quote. Neither are the economic and political consequences of partition well understood. And this, of course, is in the context of an extensive literature on what is known as one of the largest forced migrations in world history, with an estimated 17.9 million people leaving their homes, and estimates of the number killed between March 1947 and January 1948, ranging from 180,000 to 1 million. And there were also 3.4 million missing members of targeted minorities in the 1951 census. So this is sport in the literature. Nor do I need to tell you, or this audience, about the unknowns of earlier unmixing of populations. I'm going to use the term unmixing, and I think Ozan's online, will be there later. This comes from the Lausanne project. They use this word, and I think it's wonderful. The unmixing of populations along the new border separating Greece from a post-Ottoman Turkish state after the Lausanne Treaty in 1923, with its 1.5 million forcibly displaced people, as the Lausanne project describes, adding to the hundreds of thousands of Balkan Muslims unmixed and sent eastwards by less formal means over the previous decade. The 1921 Irish partition features similar historical absences, according to Margaret O'Callaghan. For example, much of the academic literature has eschewed, she argues, emphasising the terror of street burnings, riots, raids, and local disintegration. That was written in 2000. On all these views, the history of partition is a history of international disorder. But my focus, to begin with at least, is partition as a characteristic of the modern liberal international order, with its origins in the early 19th century, a period that I also think of as having invented many of the features of that same order. So I know this is not uncontroversial. Many genealogies would not even include, as Zoidberg does, the period historians often invoke as the scramble for Africa. My task is to convince you it is worth looking back a century before Lausanne to the early 19th, when partition and the logic of ethno-national conceptions of community was inscribed in a newly invented international order. To the extent that a small set of European powers assumed the authority to determine the norms of an international order and their practical application, including the practice of drawing scientific boundaries and unmixing populations. There are two other sections after that, so there's three sections. The second continues the argument by travelling to the latter end of the 19th century to Africa and the case of partitioning that some historians have argued was the model for the first partitioning of the world, which they argue also occurred in 1919. In the third section, I shift direction, looking forward rather than back, to traverse some new studies of partition, which focus on disorder and even adopt non-human framings. These are indicative of how I think how focusing on partition reveals as much about the limits of how we have studied the international order, and by implication underscores the role of our own historical narratives of partition in the fashioning and refashioning of international orders. So let's go back. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in the years of post-war peacemaking ordering that stretched from 1814 into the 1820s, a small group of European empires assumed authority for managing so-called national questions, in the most pertinent case, which is the Polish question, and partitioning Europe in new ways. So for our purposes, there were two distinctive aspects to how this was tackled. Firstly, a new Polish state was to be recreated in part after the original partition of the Polish kingdom in the late 18th century, technically it was partitioned, through a new partitioning now based in statistics, which was still a relatively youthful science in the early 19th century. And this process, I think, connects 1815 and 1919 peacemaking and boundary drawing practices rather well. From the Council of Europe appointment of a statistician, Baron Hoffmann, to the controversies that surrounded his methods and conclusions. Should numbers rather than human desires decide borders? How reliable are statistics? These are the sorts of questions that were asked in this period. And it was particularly challenging because of the out-of-date and unreliable local government sources and publications that were in the counter populations, which was really a concern there. So the idea that a previously partitioned Poland could be re-established through statistics relied heavily on the expertise of this statistician, Baron Hoffmann, To the extent that his mathematical measuring out of populations of the divided territories that were now part of Austria, Poland, and Russia were considered arm or Seelen, and earned him the nickname Seelenhoffman, Soul's Hoffman. As significantly, the sarcasm that accompanied his nickname reflected a disquiet about the reliance on numbers, which the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand protested, made an inhabitant of Poland and a resident of the rich territories of Saxony and Rhine as of equal worth. The Austrian Chancellor Metternich assumed that the committee might do something more than a mere evaluation of numbers, making room, he argued, for the riches of the respective provinces and the quality of their government. So it's a very, historical view of what kinds of partitioning will go on in this new, reunification of Poland. There are other kinds of connections between early 19th century Vienna and the early 20th century. Noting Lord Castlereagh's role at the Congress of Vienna, for Mary O'Callaghan, through the long 19th century, the same personnel turn up in location after location in the First and Second British Empires, bringing their values, their expertise, their assumptions, and what they learned in one place to another. From Cornwallis to Castlereagh, from Lionel Curtis and Philip Kerr, Lothian to Lord George and Arthur Balfour, successive cohorts of British and sometimes Anglo-Irish politicians and administrators restructured and reordered territories which they ruled in the light of successive group propensities and cultures. Their worldviews, as administrative intellectuals, created a political framework for various political arrangements. And it's in that context I'm very interested in the debate that will go on after this about Lord Curzon. As important, I would argue, is the ways in which in the same period, British imperial figures become part of a community of European imperial statesmen who self-proclaim their international authority through the instruments of law, as treaties, combined with science, the use of statistics, and even in the international ordering that involves the unmixing of populations. Now, for that example, we have to go a bit forward to 1826, when the Protocol of St. Petersburg is signed between Britain and Russia, so it's a bilateral treaty, it's not a European one, but it's followed with the 1827 Treaty of London, which is signed by Britain, France, and Russia. Now, each of these is successively meant to resolve claims by Greek independentists to Ottoman territory through the movement of property. In 1826, Britain and Russia agreed to end the contest, as they call it, this is from the treaty, between the Ottoman court and the Greeks, and establish in the East an order of things conformable to the East. This bilateral treaty conceives of a Greek peninsula dependent on the Ottoman Empire, but with a complete separation between individuals of the two nations. So that's from the text. Greeks were to purchase the property of Turks, whether situated on the continent of Greece or in the islands. The Greeks would pay a tribute and, on a new modern model, would in return receive rights, complete liberty of conscience, entire freedom of commerce, and autonomous government. The treaty-making parties rationalised their self-appointed partitioning as the answer to conflict between Ottoman and Greek parties on the grounds of what they described as their principles of religion, justice, and humanity, their own. While this treaty can also be seen as evidence of the failure of the concept of Europe because it reverted to bilateralism, I would argue the key is precisely this international framing in the sense of the universal norms. It's not just religion, justice, and humanity, but complete liberty of conscience, entire freedom of commerce, and autonomous government. When the treaty failed, the powers try again, this time drawing in France to sign the Treaty of London to resolve, quote, sanguinary struggle in the Greek provinces and islands of the archipelago that threatens all the disorders of anarchy, including the piracy that impedes the commerce of the states of Europe. Once again, the sentiments of humanity, tranquility of Europe, insisted on Greek autonomy within the Ottoman Empire and the economic separation of Christian Greeks from Muslim Turks at the cost of the latter. Quote, the Greeks shall become possessors of all Turkish property, situated either upon the continent or in the islands of Greece, on condition of indemnifying the former proprietors, either by an annual sum to be added to the tribute or by some other arrangement. As importantly, any rejection by the Ottoman parties of these terms was to be met with the alliance recognising Greece de facto by initiating commercial relations with them and sending and receiving consular agents. I would argue that these treaties signal a turning point, because firstly, the status of Orthodox Greeks in predominantly Muslim Ottoman Empire was treated as a European issue to be resolved through international mediation, even as individual European powers took up the authority themselves. B, these European powers imposed a logic that would culminate a century later, when the Treaty of Lausanne, signed in the wake of the First World War, demanded a population exchange of the Christian Greek and Muslim Turkish populations of the defeated Ottoman Empire. As part of the world partitioning that in the early 20th century was now intrinsic to the kinds of international ordering that comprised peacemaking. Now, in the early 19th century, however, the fact that some European empires might presume to decide the terms of conflict resolution as partition was not the same as the rest of the world accepting that authority. And we could look to the Monroe Doctrine, for example, as a pushback from the new United States of America, but also the Ottomans' refusal to accept the mediation because they declined to accept the intervention as legitimate in any way. They see it as unlawful and inappropriate usage of the treaty terms, mediation, arms pacification. Now, there are other people in the room who know more about this than I do, but I think, just emphasizing the use of this international language, if you like, and the conceptualization of the authority of these particular European powers to make peace in this context. And in those terms, separating out the religious groups is, I think, really important. And of course, then at this moment, though, the non-recognition of that authority is hedged by the threat of violence, military retaliation, which in fact the British, French, and Russians do use. And in 1828, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Before that, there's the Battle of Nobody knows. So now I'm going to turn to my second section, to the last decades of the 19th century in Africa, taking up the Zogway's UNESCO History of Africa essay and a specific definition of imperial role in Africa as partition. Zogway describes how Africa, a continent of over 28 million square kilometers, says was partitioned, conquered, and occupied effectively by the industrialized nations of Europe. He explains that while the 1884/1885 Berlin West Africa Conference did not technically partition Africa, by 1885, in fact, the broad lines of the final partition of Africa into some 40 political units. Into some 40 political units had already occurred. And some of those borders, about 30%, he said, were drawn as straight lines. And these numbers often cut right across ethnic and linguistic boundaries, and that's why it's kind of partition. For example, the Anglo-German delimitation of Treaty of the 1st of November 1886 placed Zanzibar and most of its dependencies within Britain's sphere of influence and effectively partitioned the pre-existing Ottoman Empire. So these are quite useful maps of the ways in which one thinks of sovereignty and linguistic difference in the African continent before partition, but also with the beginnings of the imperial colonization. And across that, we have this idea of a map that is partitioned, unities are partitioned by these growing these boundaries. The Zogway emphasizes a number of characteristics of this process, which he understands as partitioning, not least that the European policymakers persistently reference conquering subject races or backward races by the master race, tempered with, says, a generous dose of humanitarian and philanthropic zeal, so the language of humanity and philanthropy. While these rationales may have rendered the partition of Africa inevitable, he judges they were post hoc rationalizations rather than the motivation for partition. It goes very long and it goes through all sorts of different explanations of the partition, why they happen, and their consequences. He considers national prestige theory, that partition was caused by Europe's need for peace and stability at home. France sought compensation for European loss and overseas gain. England wanted to offset a European isolation by enlarging and glorifying the British Empire. And this is all then connected to an economic analysis of partition, which is always described as Europe nibbling at Africa, a process It starts well before the 19th century and intensifies during the last quarter because of the transition from the slave to legitimate trade and the subsequent decline in both the export and import trade during that period. So we've got increasing commercial rivalry. Partitioning Africa is an act of balancing commercial opportunity as it was meted out to European power. Importantly, I think, and I'll return to this, Zogwe does not agree with those African historians who insist that all the boundaries drawn by the empires were arbitrary, artificial, precipitate, or haphazard, distorting the national pre-European political order, the national pre-European. Instead, he considers that some partitioning did in fact follow national boundaries, and cannot therefore be considered as arbitrary or as ill-considered as the criticisms would suggest. Or at least they provided a corrective to the fluid boundaries, frontiers, and enclaves of the pre-European order. He emphasizes too partition as a consequence of provocations by atavistic African proto-nationalist movements, which threatened the global strategic interests of European nations. So romantic, reactionary struggles compelled reluctant European statesmen, hitherto content to exercise informal paramountcy and moral suasion in Africa, to partition and conquer the continent. Importantly, for Zogwe, this history cannot be told merely as an imperial narrative. It is much about African agency and the legitimacy of the post-imperial African national order. When we take a longer view, then, there are many similarities, I think, in the processes by which the partition of Africa reflects the earlier 19th century developments in the assumptions and practices of international order. We have the familiar rationalization of partition in humanitarian terms, the authority of European powers to make peace and to employ scientific methods of boundary marking. Here we have, of course, the role of geography, the African International Association, which employs H.M. Stanley in 1879 to explore the Congo in the name of the association, and they see themselves as the aurors, boundaries. And then there is the conferencing of European powers at Berlin in 1884, singing in unison now their agreement on the capacity of international law, or European public law, as they decided it, to underwrite their objectives on the force of humanitarian principles and civilizational rationales. Treaty making returns in this history through the international lawyers who drew up the precepts for the creation of such sovereign anomalies as the Congo Free State. But there's also something new going on, as the Ghanaian historian Albert Adebuaku notes in another essay in the UNESCO volume. I love using UNESCO volumes. This is Boaku. In recognizing the Congo Free State, permitting territorial negotiations, and by laying down rules and regulations for the legal appropriation of African territory, European powers had arrogated to themselves the right of sanctioning the principle of sharing out and conquering another continent. There is no precedent in world history where a group of states in one continent felt justified in talking about the sharing and occupation of the territory of another continent in such a bold manner. This is the major significance of the Conference of African History. Partitioning of the world, as it's known, arrived soon after in 1919, where the themes of scientific method and boundary drawing are reinforced. We have the American Inquiry and the British experts, populated by geographers, classicists, historians, utilizing their expertise, geopolitical expertise in the drawing of boundaries. And of course, we have the international cast of this process reinforced by the invention of the League of Nations as the international forum in which questions of partition were negotiated and decreed. So this period, of course, is explored in more detail in our workshop. So I want to move to the third section, where I want to shift gears away from developing a narrative that I have been developing that tells the history backwards, possibly teleologically, to reflect on other possible views onto history's partition and what they reveal about the disorder of the international order. To notice the disquiet that accompanied partition through its 20th century history and its entanglements in stories of nation building. By 1919, the history of partition is also about attempts to avoid partition through the imagining of alternative political forms and spaces. In the same international context as the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, with its culmination of this longer tendency to think about borders that separated ethnic and religious groups, modes of unmixing. Other peacemaking experiments reach back to older models of the free city and autonomous regions, And these often represented, I would argue, the disquiet with the violence of partition and its anti-democratic tendencies. For example, the League deployed the Free City idea to resolve tensions between Germany and Poland, which of course Poland had been partitioned out of the defeated Habsburg Empire in the city of Danzig. In Italy, in the context between Italy and the new Yugoslav kingdom over territory around Fiume and Trieste, Fiume in particular at this point, the idea of a free city there was also introduced, rather than turning to some notion of partition. These alternatives would be tried again in the post-Second World War period. In 1947, the Free Territory of Trieste was created as a way of resolving tensions between Italy and Yugoslavia for that territory. And the UN on the role as the overseer of this idea. So when I wrote my first book, that was my topic. Stop. It was probably I wasn't thinking for a while. So the cover, not all the cover, but the image I liked, but it's a guy with an axe. This is a local kind of play where they played out partitions. So go with an axe, standing over the territory, utilizing a visualization, that metaphor of amputation almost, that often seen partition. So in that case, the Free Territory of Trieste doesn't last very long, actually, like many of these other experiments. But I think, it was an important moment, part of a larger moment in the post-Second War period, when all sorts of ways of thinking about territory and internationalizing it were also in the air. And here one would turn to the ideas, in particular, of Emily Greenwald's. And notably also for the British and American mainly powers that kind of conceive of this idea, the Free Territory of Trieste is an economic unit, and so the economic unit is the alternative to political tensions. And recently I saw Le Monde, I think the other day, had an article on 30th anniversary of an agreement between the Italian and Austrian actors in the debate over the autonomous territory on that border around Bolzano, and how they decided to give up on this idea of partition as well. And there's a Centre for Autonomy Expertise now in Bolzano, I think it's really interesting, that tries to articulate, how these alternatives can be functional. So through the mid-20th century, partition was one idea in a larger arsenal of modern political thinking, exercised at an international level through institutions and practices that were historically situated, with existing geopolitical inequalities and conceptual paradoxes. And this same fact, I think, is part of the history of the disorder at the heart of the liberal international order. And I want to focus on that a bit now. And there is, I think, quite a bit of new work that is really exciting because of the way it takes this idea, as I see it, and pushes it to other kinds of conclusions about the kinds of histories that can be written. In the Irish case, it has been argued partitions set in train successive community enforced sub-partitions, so that in later declensions, this is Mary O'Callaghan, you end up with locations like North Belfast, where the internal partitions are literally street by street. So the higher fences make with neighbours arguing for partition as an instrument of dealing with political divisions falls down. If all partition seems to prepare for its fence after fence after fence within its newly divided space. Then there's the new work in the case of India. Discussing the short and long-term consequences of partitioning in India, Prashant Bharadwaj and Soumitra Jha remind us that partition never took place in some anodyne scientific manner. Infamously, partitioning was based on boundaries formed by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, and closer to treat far from the borderlands, while locally many believe that by changing the facts on the ground in terms of their relative population share, they could shape the ultimate location of the national borders. And they emphasize the role of existing militia who mobilized to change those facts on the ground as quickly as possible in the form of ethnic cleansing. Indeed, they argue, rather than the partition violence being an uncoordinated series of attacks of neighbour against neighbour, the massacres of Punjab in all their gruesome efficiency bore the imprint of military training and organisation. And then there's the idea that partition was the basis on which conflict becomes entrenched indeed. Lillian Laila Vasi has described the Jammu and Kashmir region, like Northern Ireland, as fabled post-partition limbo states, unable to function on behalf of the population. So taking this perspective of international disorder, I'm as interested in studies of the effects of partition that are now focusing on environmental effects. In a 2022 paper, Partition, the Environment and the Early Post-Independence Development of Lahore, Ian Talbot shows how post-partition responses to the pressures of migration and resettlement have impacted on urban planning, with long-term consequences for sustainability in the contemporary era of climate change. In Blood and Water, the Indus River Basin in Modern History, David Gilmartin reminds us that the drawing of the Radcliffe line through the Punjab cut across the rivers of the Indus Basin in several canal systems, disrupting what he describes as the ideologies of power and of rule associated with control over the river basin, and fueling new sources of conflict over water, and rendering the political effects of partition inextricably environmental. This is Martin. This was a key moment in which new visions of control over the environment after partition really shaped the way new political orders are being created on opposite sides of the border, in part justified and legitimized by claims to control over water and over nature. In 1960, another relatively new international institution, the World Bank, weighed in to mediate an Indus-Basin treaty to reorganize and expand irrigation on both sides of the border. And this led to a variety of political and environmental consequences, not least what Martin describes as a continuing tension on both sides of the border between an engineering view of water control and a political view. And he links this to authoritarian government on. Ironically, the authority of the World Bank came in the wake of initiatives to maintain a vision of the river basin as a unified natural entity, to justify some development of structures of cooperation and control between India and Pakistan. Facing the failure of this ambition, the bank, and here it would be useful to know how and why, proposed formula which moved away from cooperative control and emphasised separating the waters into two separate spheres of control. India was given 3 eastern rivers, Pakistan got 3 western rivers. We had the fences and sub-fences. In recent years, this situation in the context of water shortages has added to the limbo status and ongoing tensions of Kashmir affordability. One could also bring this environmental perspective to the Nigerian context of Izogra's essay, his inclination to see the functionality of national borders against the background of the recent memory for him of the Biafran War, a civil war in Nigeria which saw it partitioned by the Igbo, and in which ethno-nationalism and oil were equal motivations, and oil companies had a role in drawing borders with the end of this war. So, what do we do? What are the Okay, so the Biafran War, which is briefly, of course, is a secessionist war, but one could argue it's a product of partitioning that occurs in the late 19th century, and the Igbo region, go back to that in this. Let's see, the southern part of Nigeria, the latest, the Delta region, is in fact where the much of the territorial compensation is placed. Is in fact the Delta is an oil-rich region which had many of the refineries, Nigerians. So we can put the refinery oil map onto the effective map. That is part of the picture of the consequences of partitioning, but also the ways in which the Biafran states are carved out by in this civil war. I won't go any further into that because it's very complicated, of course, but just to say that I think that these environmental, ecological, environmental, economic framings could in fact and have produced really important new work. There is scope, I think, in pursuing the history of partition and its consequences from this environmental ecological economic perspective that also link us to a partition literature that has turned to the planetary. In a recent article, Beyond Growth and Partition, Post-Growth and Ecological Perspectives on the Political Economy of Irish Reunification, Sean Ferron and John Barry position the planetary emergence at the heart of contemporary debates regarding partition and its future. They argue that any debate for or against Irish reunification is ill-informed and incomplete without an understanding and acknowledgement of what they describe as our stark and unstable planetary future. The Irish Unity Project, they say, should only be discussed in terms of a post-growth position, rooted in science-based and non-negotiable ecological realities. Their approach speaks, I would argue, to the importance of connecting a new environmental history with an older political practice and historiography that interrogated the concept of frontiers and the realism of the sovereign state as the foundation of the international order. So I consider this confluence of the subjugation of the national paradigm, post-growth and ecological perspectives, as a way of opening up the prospects of a new kind of planetary history, which would bring to the study of partition not only its effects on humans as they experienced it individually, but its effects on the broader environment, and would start, I'd argue, from a skeptical view of nostalgia for what the political theorist William E. Connolly once described as a coherent politics place. So at a time when partition has returned as a possible answer to the problem of conflict in the contemporary international order, in the context not only of Ukraine but Scotland, I noticed if you Google Scotland partition, in fact, there's a debate 2021, I think, around should Scotland be partitioned, as a headline warning of British nationalist arguments for partitioning Scotland. So from the other side. Now, and in that context, I think how we write about partition matters. Alternative genealogies offer alternative ways of thinking about this history, whether in terms of the connection between high and low politics, or between national and international narratives, or what something, or how a planetary history of partition might mean something completely different. Taking a long view to the history of partition reinforces not only the elements of international ordering, the national state, ethno-nationalism, civilizational hierarchies, the objectivity of international law, the science, the rationales of peace and humanitarianism, but also underscores the significance of post-imperialism. The early 19th century reveals the simultaneously imperial, international, and national dimensions of partition thinking, the hierarchies of ordering shaping international order, the norm-making that imbued certain powers of authority in that order, that made treaties and science and unmixing the ordering instruments for achieving peace. At the same time, this genealogy does not mean we can reduce the history of partition to the history of empire. Mary Callaghan has argued that in 20th century Ireland and India and later Palestine, there were in common, she says, ideas for dealing with everything from land, crime to partitioning, traceable to pooled areas of expertise for successive British imperial cohorts. When this expertise is taken into account, even the partitioning of Palestine by the UN has in common the British Empire. By forgetting the thought worlds of metropolitan and imperial elites who operated in a variety of theatres, international, British imperial and European, by denying long habits of British imperial thought about Ireland, albeit transmuted from generation to generation, this is O'Callaghan, we risk repeating the political and ideological frame through which the conflict here has been represented and controlled for over 40 years. But she argues too that in the early 21st century, Northern Ireland, South Africa, the Middle East, and Bosnia carried post-imperial legacies inscribed in extraordinarily different ways in very different societies, but subject to an international set of assumptions about how such situations should be resolved. So I've tried to emphasize the long changing history of this international set of assumptions. The invention of the idea you can have an international set of assumptions about how such situations should be resolved. From the universal authority of European public law as international law, even when it represents the interests of a handful of European empires, to the objective authority of scientific methods, even when those methods are under European direction and contradict each other often, and the logics of territorial sovereignty, increasingly identified the logic of ethno-religious differences, even when that same logic is not applied to the dominant European imperial states. This logic is transferred by real people. Brendan Sims has argued too that in the international peace process of the 1990s, the same personnel appear from Northern Ireland to Israel, Palestine to Dayton. But it's also about how we transfer these ideas in narratives of nationalism and partition, how those stories are told. Indeed, on this long view, partition thinking returns us to what we know about the shifting and consistent intersecting influence of national thought, imperial and race ideas in the constitution of the modern liberal international order, an influence that is evident in the Zogwe's own analysis of the history of partition. This is only one of the many times when he argues that although the partition must be condemned as illegal and immoral, it must be recognised that some of the boundaries were indeed artificial and arbitrary, but it would be undesirable, indeed dangerous, to continue to advocate a return to the fluid pre-European international boundaries, set after very close scrutiny. Look at the mess that have been created by the partition. He argues for the ways in which cartographers of the period knew what they were doing. So here we have a historiography that is as conflicted as the process it is intending to map. Impacted, to be sure, by the influence of the African War, and Zogwe's own allegiance to the legitimacy and functionality, as he saw it, of the Nigerian national state that won that war, and that is ultimately, according to his own essay, a product of the imperial past and its boundary drawing exercise. Which returns me to this point: how we write the history of partition matters, contra Zogwe's methodological nationalism, untangling the threads of national and international meaning that gave legitimacy to that idea of partition might be one way. Accumulating stories of disquiet and disorder might be another. The most challenging might be a planetary state. So what are we doing? We're having a question?
Yes, now we have time for questions, both in person.
I'm going to still. Yeah. I haven't written this.
Tim Peacock, University of Glasgow, and absolutely fascinating. And I think I was really interested in the perspectives and the partitions not just being the history of empire. And I'm curious as to your thoughts regarding the use of language around even the terms partition and how we understand partition and whether that changes between different contexts. In some contexts, as you indicated there, that the partition can actually be seen as a potential, not necessarily positive, but there are different locally constituted meanings. And even dare I say it in this room, the partitions that have been designed to sort of separate the rooms out for practical uses. So I'd be really interested in any thoughts you had around that use of language and how that affects our writing or understanding.
I mean, Jane himself might actually say that. It's I don't know how much. I mean, what you do, of course, is reduce the shift of partition, and maybe speak about as a constancy.
It's still very much there. The historiographies are so fragmented.
Right.
It's very much of a work in progress, but something we can talk about over the next day or two about this partition, division, why division of Germany as opposed to partition of India, right? For example.
So what is
There's
context in
super
which gets
fast.
utilized? But I think I found most kind of problematic. The knotty thing about it for me is the way in which on one hand you've got the imperial and the international sort of entangled in there, but it's the national, right? Because it's so much based, intersects so in such complicated ways with the aspirations of national communities in a historiography that has always been talked about or seen, in history as the progress of nation building, right? And associated nation building with the rights of particular groups, and because really hard to untangle those, the different strands that come together in that petition process, because even in the imperial context, they're basically talking about reflecting desires from below, right? In some way, that there are these Greeks that are fighting a war for, their religious autonomy, and therefore we need to do something about it. But also there's kind of a vested economic interest and all sorts of other things going on. But I think, making that part of how one tracks the concept and its changing meaning would be really interesting. But it makes it much harder, I think, to move away from a human-centric focus on competition to something more challenging, right? But I think this new environmental, ecological, economic, history of history has been You take issue.
Thank you. Jonathan from Durham University. I can't abide the silence. Ill-formed question in my mind, which is about what are the treaties doing in terms of changing people's thought words and describe as. So there's a little bit of research on Myanmar, which I work on, which looks at these treaties as changing vernacular understandings of belonging, hitching them or transforming them into more universal, modular, Euro-American forms of belonging and understanding. And is that what you were seeing happening in these treaties? Are they changing subjectivities as they go around on the very terms?
I think you could ask that question too of the institutions that are set up and the kind of the legitimacy they give to certain practices and ways of asserting, rights, right? So one could deconstruct the influence that partition process had on, entrenching the idea that that there's only one way, that ethnic communities only have one way of thinking about their political futures, which lies in national autonomy and independence, and that's what matters most to people, etc. And we know that, in the work on Trieste, it's very clear that on the ground, people were much more flexible and in their view of the kind of political community, economic communities that they would operate in than from above. And it was really the influence in the context of war and the British American interest in kind of distinguishing the difference of the communist part of Europe from the virtually non-communist, non-communist, strange. Anyway, and utilizing ethnic and racial difference and really entrenching spatially and through systems of incentive and disincentive, entrenching the communities turn to these sorts of identifications. Same thing, of course, in the Bosnian wars. Then it's about when you track it on the ground. That was paramilitaries coming in and making choose, and then in that context, cross propaganda. So yeah, I mean the ways in which the local the range of options of ways of imagining political community are delimited and limited by the international order in place, like an imperial order, is part of this intrinsic part of the story. And how you get out of that loop is the problematic part. But I think partly by kind of shifting perspective in the way in which the new Irish literature is onto a more planetary perspective might be one way of just kind of removing myself from that and thinking about how do we, the challenge is how do we, arrive at some other notion of political organization that represents general interests, and what role historians have in that process by going back and looking at the history of the text, but also their origins. But there's a lot of power to historians. Then we had it in partition in the mind.
Hi, thank you. Conor Mulva at UCD. I was very interested by the allusion you made to the kind of intellectualization of partition. So the geographers, historians, the legal scholar, but particularly the classicists. And I suppose one of the obvious classic partitions is the partitioning of the Roman Empire under Diocletian. To what extent do you see that kind of, I suppose, the classical formations, or let's say the intellectual formations of colonial administrators as being influential on how they conceive of partition intellectually?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, in the Curzon discussion, look at that bit too. But it's true in, of course, in 1919, as they're kind of grasping for ways of utilizing their knowledge for these boundaries. Let's say perhaps in 1945, well, the whole boundary drawing process really falls apart, I think, in many ways. You end up having failed commissions at the time, and then trying to find alternatives to that. I mean, maybe someone else's work under a room full of people studying partition might have said that in its contribution.
And I expect I'm stating the obvious in some ways, but we could also see partitions in terms of their agency. Because they are reflective of ideologies and mindsets, their assumptions, but they also then create, reinforce, or sometimes cement these. And I remember reading and working on discourse over natural frontiers in France in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And very interestingly, there's Albert Sorel, not Georges Sorel, Albert Sorel, who was very influential in the French foreign ministry in terms of educating a couple of generations of diplomats, wrote a really interesting essay in 1874 against this idea. And he argued that a river is not a natural frontier. A river is actually something that brings two communities together. And as soon as you draw a frontier on it, make it harder to cross the river, then you're creating another political configuration. And I think that's something that is pretty clear in some of the things you said today, Glenda, about Africa, but probably all over, in that sometimes partitions have an agency that isn't foreseen by people doing the practicing of partitions.
I mean, I'm not sure I'm asked to have something in my next, but what I found really interesting in the Le Monde article on Bolsano, and they, on the one hand, the journalists, I don't know where they got the information from, but it's quite a long piece and very kind of informed, but they start off by saying, this, someone wanted to draw a line that, left, or the line that was born eventually left, a territory which, only 5% of the population within the Italian border were Italian speakers, because it was drawn across a mountain range. So that was regarded as a natural geographic line. And they said, no, but the real line, they're saying that, is actually 300 meters, the other direction, because that's where the ancient Teutonic, Latin border was drawn. I'm thinking, no, so it's kind of what is interesting, I think, in the literature is the extent to which we can take ourselves out of the logics of partition because of the ways in which it's so embedded in this civilizational, also national, the antithesis of that civilizational language, which is, the language of democratic nationalism, that somehow, each ethno-nation requires a political unit. So it not that you have to be against that or for it, the point is to take oneself out of it, right? And because I come out of the, the child of the 1990s and the deconstruction of national identity. So bringing some of that literature back into the discussion, I think, is quite interesting and useful, and reinforcing it. And here, this is not particularly relevant to partition, but I think the nation state's coming back into how we understand and analyze, but it shouldn't come back in a reified way, and we shouldn't be reifying concepts. So pulling it apart and standing outside of that is really important. Anyway, have a look at the Le Monde.
I will do. Ali told me just today that it's much easier to cross the Indo-British frontier via an airplane than it is the Indo-Pakistani frontier because of visa requirements. This is one of these partition things.
And just to go back to the relevance now. So I did have the longer version, but I did want to read a lot of that arguments for partition and against. Because in the Ukraine context, it's an interesting piece by the scientist from Sarajevo. The saying, just don't let them draw boundaries like the date piece or they ruined us by partitioning, because of course we have Bosnia, but you have the partitioning out of a Serbian bit in that, because the vocal Serbian nationalists in that region argue that they need autonomy of some kind, and then that becomes used as a way of further destabilizing the unit that gets created. So is that partitioning or not, isn't it? But he sees it as an argument against partitioning Ukraine. Don't do it, because and all it's done is, create an enemy from within, if you like. It's constantly stabilizing government. So it is interesting how at the moment there is, but in that case too, ultimately, it's making an argument for kind of a Bosnian national identity that is the basis of this Bosnia. And so it's a bit like in the Ukraine war, it's become about Ukraine nationalism, right? Which might not have been, outset, but it entrenches the idea of a national, of a particular kind of national differences. That is good for. Well, that's, I want to understand.
So we've got a question.
Yeah.
It's from Catherine. Can you comment on the role and impact of higher underlying as a deciding factor of new borders and subsequent constitutions?
Right. So I mean I think in the African context it becomes clear, the extent to which partitioning entrenches an imperial economic order. Right? The status of the kind of sovereignty over natural resources that is established in the context of the colonization of Africa, the British pressure, the Royal Niger, in the Nigerian context, the British pressure, the Royal Niger Company, the ownership and monopoly over the production of oil and its export until the nationalisation of that in the late 1960s in the context of OPEC. That's one example of the kinds of influence that economic motivations have, and in that sense, one of the arguments about how why the Biafran War is so awful is partly because the French stepped in to protect their oil production through the longer name, the French company in the region, and the British are protecting the interests of their oil production. So they are the French support the Biafran secessionists and the ideally unified Nigeria. But it's not just an economic motivation, it's about the persistence of the economic inequality that's established in the imperial period in the 19th century through the 20th, and being an issue. And in that context, the international framing becomes more interesting because it's in by the late 1960s, the idea of an international, a particular kind of international order organized through the UN also gives the capacity of so-called global south, as we now refer to it, to collaborate around trying to improve the inequalities, and this is where you get the new international economic order coming about in the plans for a new international economic order that would stabilize economic inequality in the early 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s. And so partition and ways of resolving consequences of partition are being, I think, very much occur in that context, in the context of economic interests and an existing kind of economic status quo that it's very much about the inequality, institutionalized inequality between the global north and the global south around ownership of commodities and natural resources such as oil. So I think it, and in the context of the outcome of the Biafran War, it seemed, historians have studied that aspect of more closely. It seemed as a decisive dimension of that war. And indeed, a lot of the discord, of course, and preventing the discord is due to the oil company. I don't actually think a planetary history of that, and of kind of the African partitioning through to the late 20th century, is really interesting. And I don't know I keep using this too, and I've been talking to other historians like Stephen Mashikura and then political scientists like Jonathan Blake about it. Niels Gilman and Jonathan Blake have a book on planetary governance coming out. But you know what a planetary history might look like. It's not a question of scale. It's a question of what of the perspective one takes. And in this case, yes, I think it's worth asking what that might look like for history.
So we have 1 minute, so if I can ask a question, I was going to ask you to comment a little bit further about, as you ended your keynote, you asked us to think about the level of the planet, and this is what you just mentioned. So I'm wondering if there could be other ways of conceptualizing, perhaps topography. I think Peter was talking about, you talked about mountains and how when you're trying to partition certain lands, where partition will work in practice will widely differ based on the topography. And I got interested in partition because of my interest in the Bengal Delta and many partitions. And I find that it's very hard to, there are multiple partitions, they exist, but it's really hard to enforce partition because there's more land than water, because it's the largest delta in the world. So perhaps that may be one way, but perhaps not the only way. So if you could share some thoughts on that.
And then how to historicize it or how to actually do it?
No, in terms
I
of,
don't know how to do that.
but what should we grapple with? It's not the nation state. There are certain tools that have or have not worked. Because we will have an edit volume out of this at some point. So it's just to get us.
I'm actually interested in emphasizing the history of disorder and describe it. So then you find that there is a history of not just historians, but people who grapple with, what are the alternatives, right? Is this really what, should we be doing something else? And even when it fails, it's worth, as historians and not political scientists, it's worth sort of thinking about just how wide the imagination is regarding, the forms and how people might organize themselves in communities. That's why I find so interesting, Emily Greenwald, she's working in the 1940s, and she writes in geographic magazines and newspapers. She doesn't have like a proper academic venue for it, but she talks a lot about the importance of internationalizing the Arctic, for example, or these bits of the world where since Houston that they started to partition it. Classic is the Antarctic, right? How it's all partitioned, but you can think of it in other contexts. Well, that's not a rabbit hole, but so I think that's an important history to ask that question and ask it of the past. How did people in that region or people thinking about that region imagine alternatives, right, or problems with the partitioning? So not just Radcliffe, but everybody that went no, this is going to work, and that's really important to get down on paper and to think about as another history. Kind of anti-methodological history, because partition has embedded in it logics. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I don't want to abuse my position as the organizer. Okay, thank you very much. We had a